Hey, it's Glenn, and I'm here to talk to y'all about my first novel, Werewolf, Shadow of the Werewolf, which came out way back in 1999. Okay, so I made a list of bullet points to talk about for this book because it's not a short story, it's a novel, so I can't easily just sit down and start rambling. So if I look off, I'm looking at my list, which is precariously tucked under the camera, so it might fall. Anyway, moving on. So, Werewolf, where this book came from, I think, is interesting because I used to write really weird short stories for my creative writing class in school, in high school, and at one point I wanted to do something different than what I had been writing, which were just absurd, basically cartoons. And I was thinking, werewolves don't scare me, but they should. And I racked my brain trying to think of a way and force some kind of a frightening werewolf story out of myself, and it never came together. I couldn't think of a way to make werewolves really scary because I don't know why they aren't scary to me, or they weren't scary to me. Well, no, they aren't scary to me. There was there was some movie I saw when I was a kid that terrified me when I was a little kid with, I think it was called The Beast Must Die, and I want to say Peter Cushing was in it, and I could be wrong on both counts, but I saw it on television and I was horrified and couldn't sleep for nights, and I wanted that feeling to come across in a werewolf story for me again, and that's why I wanted to write it, but never worked, and I gave up on it because I'm thinking, werewolves, you shoot them with a silver bullet. Like, I mean, everybody's got them lying around, I guess, but seems like they would be pretty easy to get away from, or, lock the door. I don't know. They just didn't strike me as particularly frightening. So, years later, I'm in bed. I think it's 1995. Yes, it was 1995. So I was in my early 20s, 20 or 21, and I just woke up with this outline in my head. The entire story of Werewolf was in my head beat for beat, and I jumped out of bed and just started writing it down. I don't know where it came from. It was just fully developed in my head, plot-wise. I mean, of course, there are always surprises when you sit down to write the actual manuscript, but plot-wise, as far as the story of Daniel Mason, and there will be plenty of spoilers in this little chat, so be warned if you haven't read it and don't want it spoiled. It's $5.99 on Kindle. I'll get to that at the end of it, the availability at the end of this video, but you can stop this, go to Amazon, find the format you prefer, read it, come back. Video's not going anywhere as far as I know. Now where in the heck was I? Alright, so the whole story of Daniel Mason in this book was there in my head, and I wrote an outline. Like, the first time I've ever written an outline, it was chapter by chapter, sort of, what happens, the basics of what happens in every chapter, and I still plot novels this way today. But I mean, I was possessed by this story, and I didn't try to think of it. It was there, and werewolves were scary again. So, and as I've said before, my horror stories don't frighten me particularly, but I knew there was something about this werewolf that was going to chill people, and hearing back from readers, I accomplished that. I think I'm too close to the characters. They're all too vulnerable and real to me to be actually personally frightened to the point of losing sleep over the things in these stories. I think that's got to be the thing that makes these not scary to me, but I felt like even though it wasn't scary to me, it was a scary idea, and that wasn't even the point of the book. As far as it just popping in my head, it just kind of happened to have a frightening element, a totally new twist, like, on the physicality of a werewolf. I was as surprised by the story as anyone who picks up the book and reads it, because I didn't force it, it was just there. So, writing the book took me a couple of years, actually, because I had never written a novel before. I hadn't even had any aspirations of being a writer beyond little comic strips I would do. I thought it would be great to write cartoons, but as far as prose writing, I had no such ambitions, but here was the story and I had to write it. So every time I sat down to write, I would think I had no business doing this, I had no idea what I was doing, I should stop before I make an idiot out of myself. But chapter by chapter, I eventually wrote through all of my self-doubts. I got through the manuscript. I think I finished the rough draft of this novel on Mother's Day of 1997, which is when I had set the book. Like, when I started writing it, I set it in the future. It was set in 1997 from the beginning. And so, I mean, it's just kind of interesting, because it's not like I planned to take 2 years to write it. I had no idea. I thought I'd write it in a few weeks, but no. There was life and, you know, the fact that I had all these doubts that made me not able to write every day. But that was another strange twist. Finished it the year that it takes place. So it was 2 years from concept to finished manuscript, and another 2 years from that to publication. But writing, yes, it was a challenge. It was a terrifying thing. Just to write it and know that I'm doing this, and letting friends read chapters as I went, and just really putting myself out there with it. And I mean, I read an interview with Stephen King years later where he said basically the same thing, that he kind of, even today, feels like a hack when he's writing. And it's, I guess, a common thing with creative people, that we all feel kind of like frauds, and but we do it anyway because we don't have a choice. And that's where this novel came from. I did not have a choice. So, onto the characters. You know, I get a lot of feedback on the characters, how they're also, they have different layers, except for the protagonist. Daniel is a very flat, two-dimensional character, and I acknowledge that, and it was by design. That's who the character was. He wasn't as two-dimensional really as he appeared at face value, because the fact is, my battery is about to die. But hold on. Okay. I'm back, and the camera is plugged in, so we should be good for the rest of this. Alright, so where was I? Characters. Right. Daniel's character is appearing to be very flat. That, when he's actually not. The problem is he's a deeply flawed character, even when he appears to be flawless. And that's really the whole point of the story, so, you know, I'll come back to that. As far as the other characters, and the town of Nightfire, Texas, which I've gone back to in my writing repeatedly, because I fell in love with it. It was full of all these really strange people, and I based the town of Nightfire pretty much on my church at the time. And because, you know, there were all of these characters, and I wouldn't say that any one character represents any one person in my life. Everyone's an amalgam. That's kind of how it works. I throw everyone I know into a blender, including myself, and shake it up and pour, and there's a character. But there was a lot of influence because the church operated very much like a small town. There was, you know, you had the guy that cuts everybody's hair, you have the painters, the people who work in the shops you shop at, the old people, the young people. It's a microcosm within the big city of Dallas, Texas, where I live, that I think represents, to me, just it's a small, tight-knit community where you don't necessarily know everyone there. There are like hundreds of people, whereas in Nightfire there would be thousands of people, but as far as the cast of characters and who you cross paths with every day, church is a great place to start as far as building a small town in fiction. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of influences from in characters. Alright, so on to what this book is actually about. It's not really about a werewolf. I mean, that's pretty much anything I write. Read it at face value and I will tell you that's not really what it's about. To me, it is about false faith. It's about the dangers of all or nothing binary thinking, which is going to bring us back to the character of Daniel Mason, the two-dimensional character. He's just Mr. Goody Two-Shoes Bible thumper at the beginning of this novel, and yes, he was annoying. He was annoying for me to, like, I was annoyed with him through the whole book. The whole book. Because he's such a, you know, really he's a jerk, and that's his character. So that's why I would say he isn't two-dimensional, because when he appears to be Mr. Goody Two-Shoes Bible thumper, he's hiding all of these flaws beneath the surface. This, I'm going to keep saying the term binary thinking. It's all or nothing. It's this way or it's not this way. Like, I have a cousin, for example, of what I'm talking about, and you know, we were actually talking about God and spiritual things in general, and her mindset is, I can't believe in this aspect because then I'd have to believe in all of it. And I don't get that. Like, to me, why do you have to believe all of it? Like, why do you have to believe anything? I think belief, and that's also another theme in this book, really, that's kind of subtly woven between the lines, that belief is a dangerous thing. Belief is the line you draw in the sand beyond which you refuse to think. And that's Daniel. He had his beliefs, and he had his beliefs about what it meant to be a good person, and he was striving to be that good person that he believed he needed to be in order to be right with what he believed about God. And when it started to unravel, when he became a werewolf and things stopped going his way, even when he prayed, even when he begged for things to turn around and they didn't, he just let go of everything because it was all or nothing, and that had been his character from the beginning. And so then he went full evil because he couldn't be full good as far as what he believed that meant. He turned on God, he turned on his faith, he turned on himself, really. And for Daniel, you know, he's a werewolf, he's killing people, and he now has the ability to see spirits with his werewolf eyes, and so he'll kill people and he'll see what happens to them after they die. So he sees two brothers who he perceived as bad people because they were drug dealers. He saw them go to heaven along with their pet chicken, while the Sunday school teacher he killed, who he perceived as a good person because she was a Sunday school teacher and a woman of faith, got dragged into hell. Little did he know she had murdered her husband. Little did he know about the drug dealers. They had been doing what they'd been doing to support their mother, and you know, they needed the money desperately, and they weren't bad people. And just, you know, his binary thinking can't accept these shades of gray, that you can't just say this person's good because and this person's bad because. Everyone has layers. And so Daniel can't even accept his own layers when he's praying and, you know, having visions and dreams of the devil reaching out for his hand, and when he finally then actually encounters an angel in the story, Daniel can't accept his layers. He can't accept his shades of gray. So he asks the angel to take the werewolf away from him. The angel says no, but, and he doesn't hear the but. He refuses to hear the but in that encounter. He doesn't get what he wants. He doesn't get what he perceives as the merciful solution, the solution that he as a good person is deserving of. And so that's the moment where he throws it all away. He doesn't want to hear the alternatives. He just becomes Godzilla at that point and just sort of tears through the town and embraces the werewolf, the beast inside of him. And that's where the book, you know, that's where the book ends, pretty much. I mean, if you've read it, you obviously know it's not that simple. There's a lot that happens event-wise, but it's pretty much, that's the story, is he stops fighting to be this good person and embraces this monster that he's become because he can't be anything in between. He doesn't understand it, he doesn't believe it, and that's his weakness. So, and that's the thing, yeah, I mean, he kills everybody. I was in this weird, my early writing career was just all about everybody dies. I said it before in a video, there's not one happy ending in anything that I wrote in 1999. So, right, so he burns down the church, decapitates his pastor friend, drives off into the sunrise, and that, as far as I knew, was that. That was the end of the story. And so, that came out in 1999. The second edition came out in 2014, and the second edition gave me an opportunity, and that's what you have, that's what's available on Amazon right now. That's what was free on Kindle, so that's what you read if you took advantage of the free promotion. But one thing I added a prologue, because when the first one came out, I always felt like it started too slow. Like you have 4 chapters of just people being people, no mention of werewolves. Actually, yeah, werewolves aren't even mentioned until chapter 5, which is actually, it's fine. But I wanted, and I think this is more true to the way that I pace my writing today, I wanted it to start off a lot faster. And I wanted the werewolf. I wanted you to know, page 1, if you didn't read the jacket synopsis, I wanted you to know when you open this book, you're reading a creepy story about a werewolf. So I added the prologue that's in the 1850s, which is, it takes place after the werewolf plague story that you read about in chapter 6. It's several months later, in 1851. And you have the pastor, the first pastor, passing the torch to the second pastor before he gets the heck out of that town, and telling him, you know, handing him the book with the story of the werewolf plague of 1850, and then you jump to, you know, me and numbers, I think it's 141 years later. Nope, it's not. 146. What? I'm gonna look. It's completely unimportant, but now that I don't know what I'm talking about, I have to correct the situation. It is 146 years later, and then it's, you know, it's the chapter 1 from the first edition, and we move forward. And I like it. I mean, I love it now that there's that prologue. I don't feel like it's as necessary as I thought it was, but I think it's an addition I would never cut again. So, I mean, I didn't do any, like, Greedo shoots first kind of changes in the second edition. Just polished it up, fixed some punctuation errors, and, you know, one thing that was really interesting for me was the dialogue that I'd written. I would never write dialogue like that today, but I left it as it was, because it was something that I had done intentionally in that book. Was I wanted to capture time in a bottle, and the way that the teenagers talk in that novel is the way that my friends and I talked at that time as well, in our late teens and early 20s. And that's fantastic to me. It's what I wanted to do. It sounds a little bit weird, I think, today, some of the phrases they use, but that's, you know, it was the 1990s, and they were silly teenagers. So, but like I said, I'm not as interested in as realistic dialogue today. I think today I just let the characters talk. And sometimes it's maybe similar to the way, like, Dario Young in some short stories that I've done in the Nightfire universe, where, you know, he's just foul-mouthed, and he's like some of the kids I worked with as a youth minister. It's like, some of that's realistic, but then some of it's way over the top. Some of the ways characters talk in the stuff I write now is more flowery than reality. And in Cry Wolf, I try to keep it basic. I try to keep it really real, that they aren't necessarily saying flowery things. Maybe as I got through the book a little ways, they started doing that, but a little bit more. But as far as, you know, most of the teenagers, they talk like teenagers talked back then. And it was very silly, but I left it alone because it's exactly what I wanted it to be. I'm looking at my bullet points now. Alright, yes, and the series title, when it first came out, it was just called Cry Wolf. Now it's called Cry Wolf, Shadow of the Werewolf. Shadow of the Werewolf being the series title, because, well, when the first book came out, when I wrote it, it was, well, the outline that I had, that was a finished story. There was no book 2. It's Daniel drives off into the sunrise and it's over. Very sad. Very sad story, but it's done. But even as I was writing those closing chapters, that's why the character, the very mysteriously appearing Julius character at the end of the book, I put in there because an idea for what happens next was already forming in my head as I'm getting through the manuscript, but I didn't feel like I had to tell that story. I felt like it was there, it was forming, and if I told it, I didn't want this Julius character to come out of nowhere. I didn't, I wanted to put elements in that would be relevant should I continue this as a series, but I had no real intention of doing that necessarily. I would have been comfortable with this just being done, but but now, of course, I've been working on the sequel on and off for years, and I'll get to that at a later bullet point. But it is a series, it's going to be a series, so Shadow of the Werewolf is the series title, and that's why it was added. Next bullet point. Right, so I think the biggest thing I got more out of this novel as far as, so I'm going to talk a while, but as far as who I am as a writer, that's the biggest thing I got from this, was becoming a writer and starting to learn who I was as a writer. This is the first thing I wrote where I really became the characters as I wrote them. Like, I developed split personalities to write this book, and I always tell people, if I didn't write fiction, I would have split personalities, because I have all of these fully developed other people in my mind, and I'm living their lives on the page, really. It's sort of reporting, it's sort of living alternate lives. It's strange because it almost feels like there's very little actual, what I would feel comfortable taking credit for as creating. I'm just sort of, it's happening. I mean, it's coming out of my subconscious, so I don't feel, I just kind of go with it. And these characters, I just kind of went with them. And so that they were more than just bullet points themselves, like, to carry the plot forward. They had fully developed personalities and histories, and so that, that carries over today. I've gotten better at that, because I feel like the first part of this book I was a little stiff writing because I didn't know what I was doing and I was terrified. And I loosened up a little bit more. The characters got more interesting as the book went on. Especially Daniel's mother. I don't know where that came from. That wasn't even in the outline. But, I mean, I just had Lillian going to talk to Daniel's mother and tell her that Daniel's a werewolf, and it went badly. Nothing about Barbara's backstory. That just came out of her mouth, and I was just as freaked out as Lillian. Especially considering this is coming out of my subconscious, and I look at my writing like dreams that can be interpreted. I know I've said before, but some things I'm just like, I don't know if I want to know where that came from. Barbara Mason being one of those things. Right, and I already talked about capturing time in a bottle as one of my objectives, and it's something I like to do even now, not to the same degree, but if I write things that are more historical, like I fleshed out the backstory, the 1850 story, a little bit better in the second edition. There are some additional references to history that I couldn't find in the library. I had librarians running ragged. We didn't have the internet. I mean, we did, but it wasn't what it is. So there was no Wikipedia, there were no moon phase calculators that I use to death now in my story planning. But I couldn't find the exact date of the full moon in August of 1850. Well, now I've got the exact date. So we were able to add some more detail. But who am I talking about? See these characters, and I have split personalities. I think of this as like a group effort, but right, and I've lost my train of thought. I'm looking at my bullet point list again because I have no idea what I was talking about. Alright, so capturing time in a bottle. And then, I write things set in the 70s, or, and I try to remember things from that time period, even though I was a very tiny boy. But I think it's kind of, I'm transmitting a story to the future, but I also feel like it's a time capsule. I'm telling them in a way, even though it's a werewolf story, it's a fantastical story. Anything I'm writing, I feel like in a way I'm also transmitting into the future my observations of time, of the time in which I live, and my experience being a person of this time. That's really, that's one of the reasons I'm on YouTube, is just to transmit these moments in time into the distant future. That's, I'm funny like that. So, what else? Bullet points. Oh my gosh, and yes, I learned in this novel that I'm crazy. That there's always going to be some weird comic relief in pretty much anything I write. Except for Aries Cage, which is unintentionally hilarious in itself, but just for existing. But, the chicken scene, for one, in Cry Wolf, where the chicken attacks the werewolf, and, yeah, that was weird. And that's something, it wasn't in the outline, it's just something that came out of my subconscious again, and I have found that that happens all the time. Everything I'm writing, there's something very weird that just comes out of nowhere, happens, and then the story moves on, and I like that. I mean, sometimes I let it take over, like with the Mech Valley debacle, but where it was just the characters were in a cartoon. But for the most part, if I'm writing a horror story, it's like my mind will not let me just go completely dark. It has to turn on a flashlight here and there and have some levity. But so that was interesting. That just there's always going to be some madcap thing in the middle of a dreary, terrifying horror novel, and I'm comfortable with that. But it's something that I first really recognized in this, even in The Ghost in the Olive Grove, which came out first, but I wrote it later, which is a very short story. There's hardly time for something weird, but just the little reference to her husband had left her for an ex-prostitute named Glowy and moved to Iceland, just strangeness. But so that's something I learned about who I was as a writer, and just I learned to express myself, like my spirit, who I am, through the characters, through the situation, through the story itself. And there were things I'd pull out of my life that just kind of fit. Like, Daniel has this recurring nightmare about a wolf chasing him, and that I had forgotten I put that in there until I did the second edition, and I was rereading the whole manuscript, and I was like, oh, that's that dream that I used to have when I was in kindergarten and first grade about this terrifying white, like albino Doberman Pinscher chasing me, and my boots, I was wearing boots, and they just would get so heavy and I couldn't run and it was catching up with me. And it's kind of, sort of combined with another recurring nightmare I had as a child about being killed by a wolf as a cowboy. It's a weird, that's a whole other topic, but yeah, so I'd give characters things like that that are straight out of my life sometimes. Most of the time they're blendered, everything's an amalgam. But another thing about Daniel Mason that I said in an interview years ago, that I still find one of the most interesting parts of his character, is that if he came from my subconscious, who he was, I mean, at the beginning of the book, he's striving to be the person that I thought I should be. By the end of the book, He's become the person that I feared that I was. So he is a complete expression of self, even though he's the most annoying character I have ever written. I guess he represents the most annoying parts of my self. And another theme that manifested, that's stayed with my writing for years and years and years, is apparently I have issues with religion. and I'm okay with that. Like, I think I'm in a different place perspective-wise with my religious issues today than I was then. Back then I was struggling with it. Today, I think it's a fine thing to have problems with religion and to question and to rail against the injustice within a system that claims to be the voice and hands of God on earth, which it's not. But again, another topic for another time. I'm not going to go way off on that. This video is already going to go on forever. But you know, with like Daniel burning down the church, then you have a scene in the Chronicles of Nightfire, Texas, Volume 1, where there's a Bible burning. There's one of the characters just lights a Bible on fire and throws it in the bathtub, and we got the rainbow-colored sheep, which again I wrote after I wrote this, even though it came out first. But the rainbow-colored sheep is nothing but issues with religion and the hypocrisies of my religion at the time, Christianity. That was my experience, so that's what I was writing about. Really, I mean, you've got, and then I wrote Beat a Rabbit years later, that, or the Briar Patch Evangelist, with this rabbit who's a television evangelist going around killing people who don't conform to his rigid views of what's right and what's wrong. It's a theme that is still there in my writing, and I feel like I've worked through it a lot through my writing, and it started with Cry Wolf, and I've come out on the other end of it now. So it'll be interesting to see where that theme goes in my writing moving forward. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I just kind of, I embraced my struggles with dogmatic religious thinking with this novel. And that brings us to my last bullet point, which is the On Again, Off Again sequel that I've been working on since, I think, 1998. Maybe it was a little later. It wasn't that long after I finished the first one that I started working on the second one. And actually, yeah, I think it was later than 98, but it was still, I've been working on it a long time. It took place in 1998. That's what it was. It took place, the whole idea was it was going to be 1 year-ish after the first book and catch up with Daniel. And it never, like, nothing that I've written over the years has ever been thrown out. It was just, you know, where is it going? And I had never sat down and written out an outline, a chapter by chapter for this book. It just kind of, the characters were demanding to come out, so I had to start writing. And I'm just like, okay, here's Daniel, here's what he's doing in 1998, or 1997 is when it starts. I'm rambling, but the sequel is now, I've got the outline, it's moving full speed ahead. Because what I figured out finally is that the missing ingredient was time itself. And I don't, like, I still see Cry Wolf as a self-contained story. The sequel is a second story. It's going to spread out over multiple books, but the sequel is a story of Daniel the werewolf, pretty much. And of Daniel kind of snapping out of it, and it's a story about, well, I don't know how much I want to say at this point, but because it's coming out next year, the first one. But right, it turns out if I set it all in 1998, it's not going to work. If I set it in the current decade, it works brilliantly. And hopefully you'll agree with me when it comes out, but the on again off again sequel is very on at this point, and it's not going to be off again. So you can look forward to that if you enjoyed the first book. And honestly, I feel like if you didn't enjoy the first book, or if you didn't even read the first book, you'll be able to pick up the second one. Because it's the beginning of a new story, and it will fill you in on anything that you missed that was important in the first book. But I think if you did read the first book, you'll be glad you read the first book. But so that's where it is. And you know, I've spun a whole universe out of this one novel, and it's been quite a ride. This novel really, it didn't begin my publication career, my career as a published author, but it did begin my career as an author. So as an author of this sort of thing, I should say, because yes, I did write cartoons, which I love, and one day I'm going to do something with those. But this book is very important to me. I don't think I could write it the way that it was written today. As I said, I've grown, I've changed, and but I'm glad it exists. It's a time capsule, and I like every opportunity to go back and revisit it. It's one of those things where I cringe when I think about it, but then when I actually open it up, I get sucked into it, and I'm like, oh, this isn't actually that bad. It's kind of good. Which, you know, one would hope that a novelist would like his or her own work. But I think that's common. I think we all cringe when we think of stuff that we've moved on from, until we're forced to actually look at it again up close. But right, so availability, the free promotion has ended. There may be another one at some point this year, I'll let you know. But meanwhile, there's a hardback and trade paperback you can get anywhere, and the ebook is available on Kindle. So, and all the ebooks I've talked about so far have been 99 cents. This one I think is $5.99, because, you know, it's a whole novel, but that's cheaper than a lot of novels that are out there for like $15 on Kindle, which I think is ridiculous. But anyway, so if you haven't read it, it's still out there. You just have to pay for it now. Unless you've got Kindle Unlimited, I hope I'm saying that right. In which case, of course, you can borrow it or read it for free whenever. But there you go. Those are my thoughts at the moment on Cry Wolf. So if you read it, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't read it, I hope that you will. But for now, that's all I've got to say, so I'll talk to y'all later.